since I'm paying for the microphone, I'm going to ask the first question. This is back to the really mainly on the low-skilled side, so I guess it would be more for Jason and for Peter. It may well be true that some substantial share of Americans at the lower end of the labor market who aren't already employed may be kind of hard to employ. In other words, they may have substance abuse problems, there may be ex-cons, there may be all kinds of things like that. And so some employers may figure, well, it's just better just not to deal with that and just hire immigrants instead. And, you know, as Kevin pointed out, they're probably more deferential and obedient in a lot of ways because Americans are kind of obstreperous. So my point is, what's the answer to employer responses, which often may just be, in fact, you had said that, Jason, that, well, you know, they're just better workers and Americans are lazy.
Well, I think that there is a lot of truth to the stereotypes, unfortunately. I mean, we know that partially because of the ubiquity of what's expressed by employers, particularly in anonymous interviews. And as both Peter and Mark mentioned, I mean, statistically, we know that low-skilled natives do suffer disproportionately from drug addiction problems, criminal background, welfare dependency. I would certainly not lay all those problems at the feet of immigration. I think it's all of a piece in some way. But the point is this: if we're going to address that problem, we have to stop using immigration as a crutch. Essentially, what's going on is nobody really has to care that these problems exist among low-skilled natives because we have immigrants to do the work for us. I mean, can you imagine how the conversation would change if the flow of foreign labor were cut off tomorrow? Suddenly, employers would have to appeal more directly to natives. They would have to advertise. They would have to raise wages. They would have to look at the working conditions. And I hope it would start a conversation in which the workers themselves also are willing to meet the employers halfway in understanding that you have to do the work that's available to you, you have to show up on time. I think that, as I said, the whole conversation changes once you cut off that flow and sort of give everyone the economic incentive to figure out these problems, reintegrate low-skilled natives, not even just into the labor force, but into civil society in general.
Peter?
Yeah, I don't know of any studies that actually show that American workers, low-skilled workers, are poorer workers than illegal immigrants are, for example. That may be the case anecdotally. You know, you hear about the hardworking illegal immigrant, and, you know, probably we've all encountered, and as a labor and employment lawyer, I encounter this, you encounter the American worker who is maybe not as hardworking. But the fact of the matter is that these types of maladies with respect to substance abuse, engagement in criminal activity, they're ubiquitous in the low-skilled labor market, regardless of whether or not they are lawful workers or illegal immigrant workers. We had at least one witness, I think it was Professor Vernon Briggs of Cornell's Industrial Labor Relations College, that said the reason why the employers prefer illegal immigrants over black American workers isn't so much that black Americans, you kept hearing during the course of the immigration reform debate, that immigrants do the jobs that Americans won't do. And that's not what the data show. And what we do see is that some employers can find a greater receptiveness for the type of wages that they're offering, and also the type of working conditions that they're offering, which are below that which Americans are accustomed to and are willing to work at. Americans will do any kind of work provided that they're paid at an American competitive level, whereas illegal immigrants will do it because it's much better than the country, the level of wages and working conditions of the country from which they're coming. But in addition to that, employers may prefer them because, as we found, and I think Professor Briggs testified to this, that, let's face it, employers understand that illegal immigrants are far less likely to complain to the EEOC, to OSHA, or the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. So you can have substandard working conditions, and the probability that you're going to get a visit from your friendly neighborhood OSHA inspector is less than if you have Americans working there who understand what their rights are. Same with the EEOC, as Jason's just indicated. Americans know they can file an EEOC charge. Legal immigrants will not file an EEOC charge for obvious reasons. And Kevin indicated they're a more quiescent workforce. Well, you don't want to be deported. You don't want ICE to show up, so you probably keep your head down, whereas Americans are unlikely to do that. That may be the dynamic, but it's not good for American workers.
Peter, are the proceedings from the Civil Rights Commission hearings online somewhere?
Yes,
at
they
the-
are. You can go to the usccr.gov, and you can go back and see what those hearings are like. As I said, all of the witnesses, regardless of where they stood in the political perspective, agreed that competition from legal immigration hurts, both from an employment level standpoint and a wage standpoint, Americans, but particularly black Americans.
Any questions? Yeah, Peggy? Hold on, wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm Peggy Orchowski. I'm a congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook magazine, and we focus mainly on higher ed, so I'm very interested in the impact of foreign students. And we know that there's no limit to foreign student numbers, visas that are given out, both J's and F's. We know that the OPT, the optional practical training, has been extended now to almost 3 years. And a lot of those foreign students are hoping to get H-1B temporary visas or green cards. Do you know, has that increased? Have the number of H-1Bs, are the sources former foreign students? And what is the chain there?
Right, the H-1Bs, we're looking at about 85, anywhere from 85 to about 120,000 H-1B visas that are given out each year. What we found is OPT is beginning to eclipse that, the number of OPT visas being issued. And the reason being is they're looking a little more closely at the H-1B visa applications. So we have that's what's going on there. As you mentioned, J1s, F1s. J1s, of course, are favored by universities. And what we see, again, is this preference for hiring foreigners over American. For instance, in the postdoc era, Nature magazine did a really good article on this 2 years ago, where one Chinese postdoc student went into the HR person at the university and said, look, I'm working 80 hours a week in the lab, and I've been asked to take a 20% cut in pay. Is that normal? And the truth is, unfortunately, it is. And with OPT, for instance, I don't know if a lot of people in the audience are aware, but there's no, the employer is not required to pay SSI, so that's a 15% haircut. They're not required to pay SSI.
Well,
So-
payroll taxes in
Payroll
general,
taxes
for
in general.
Medicare and for Social Security, et cetera.
Correct.
Right.
And that's about a 15% premium that is added to hiring someone on the OPT program. And again, these people compete directly with our new graduates in the workplace. And again, look at it just relatively speaking. A student today might exit university with anywhere from $35,000 to $85,000 in debt. That's a lot of money. And if they're being handicapped, they're having their legs broken as they leave the gate into the workplace, that cannot be good. Did I answer your question?
Any other questions? Yeah, hold on. Wait for the mic.
How would you respond? I have knowledge in this area, but I was interested in you about the low-wage labor market, to the argument, look, well, unemployment is low, and about that unemployment statistic, what would you say to it, that unemployment even for African Americans, or even less educated African Americans, looks better now than it has in the recent past? Obviously, it was once better, or perhaps once better, but what would you say to that the unemployment rate, after all, looks pretty good?
And just before you answer, the president himself has made this argument for actually increasing immigration
He has.
precisely because the unemployment rate is low.
Unemployment rate. What doesn't it capture?
So the unemployment rate, of course, refers only to people who are looking for work. And the broader measure of people who are in the labor force would be the labor force participation rate. So unemployment rate is quite low right now, but the labor force participation rate, particularly among prime age men, which is the one I like to look at the most because they have the least excuse for not working or looking for work, is still quite low by historical standards. I mean, it just has gone gradually down. It's affected slightly by recessions and economic booms, but not so much. And so, people have referred to the current unemployment rate as being, among the lowest since 1969. But if you could look at labor force participation rate, it's far, far lower. In '69, virtually every prime age man had a job or was in Vietnam. These days, it's what, 12% or so, 10 to 12%, at least in the low skill, who are not even looking for work. And as I said, they don't have much excuse to not be working. I would also point out, though, that when you have a low unemployment rate, this is exactly the time that marginal workers could potentially benefit. This is the time when the ex-felon might get a second look because of a low unemployment rate, or the person with a disability who can mostly do the job but requires some accommodation that's somewhat costly. That's the time when these people can really benefit from a strong economy. And I fear that we're completely short-circuiting that process if we keep bringing in guest workers, not enforcing the law against illegal immigration, and so on.
I actually kind of had a question for Peter. You talked about how the Congressional Black Caucus really wasn't all that interested in the kind of things you were finding. What do you think is behind that? In other words, why?
Yeah, I can't speak for them. I think, though, that they have an allegiance to whatever the reigning orthodoxy is in the Democratic Party. And the reigning orthodoxy was, at the time, broadening immigration, including illegal immigration, and I think there was a political imperative attached to that. I mean, no one's ever really done any studies or anything like this, but I think it's pretty plain that, you hear almost every day from various cohorts that one of the electoral aims of the Democratic Party, or at least among progressives, is to increase the percentage or the number of people likely to vote for Democrats. And they hope that, blacks used to be the most reliable and still are the most reliable constituency among the Democratic Party. And they were hoping, and there's actually been some commentary about this, and I think somebody wrote a book about it, that the aim was to change the demographics of the country to be more favorable to a Democratic electorate. So I think that may be a component of it. But beyond that, I'm baffled. Again, they call themselves the Congressional Black Caucus, and I would think they'd be concerned about issues that face the black community, and this is a significant issue that faces the black community. And I think Jason's right with respect to the labor force participation rate. The labor force participation rate still is not where it should be. But particularly among those individuals who have no more than a high school diploma, we're talking about labor force participation rates that are abysmal. Back in the 1983, 1984, 1985, when the economy was mediocre at best, somewhat stagnant, blacks without a high school diploma had there's a U6 rate, there's all kinds of unemployment rates in addition to the labor force participation rate. But we are at 24.6% unemployment. That's extraordinary. Now it's far lower than that, of course, and the economy is booming. But to answer the question of, the economy is doing well, labor force participation rate is better than it had been, unemployment rate is low. Well, everything is cyclical, and at some point that's going to change for a variety of factors, and those who are going to be harmed by an influx of low-skilled, low-wage labor are going to be Americans in that same category.
One interesting point I thought was that I'd mentioned the 1986 law, and so much of the discussion was about how immigrants were going to be discriminated against because they were immigrants and not get jobs, which obviously we're seeing the exact opposite. But because of that, in the Department of Justice, there was an office, let me get the name right because it's a mouthful, Office of Special Counsel for Immigration-Related Unfair Employment Practices. But what that office has always done is go after employers that receive a fishy-looking green card from a new hire, and they say, you got anything else? This doesn't really look good. And then the Justice Department comes down on them like a ton of bricks. Would part of the solution potentially be to expand the remit of the Office of Special Counsel to look at discrimination, immigration-related, unfair employment practices, but discrimination against American workers? Is there anybody any talk of anything like that? In other words, institutionalizing this issue rather than having Jason do word searches and find it in EEOC but my point is make it systematic.
Right. It's interesting. You look at the high end, for instance. Let's look at doctors, for instance. Every year, roughly 1,000 graduates of U.S. medical schools, and I'm talking Caribbean schools, I'm talking U.S. medical schools, do not get residencies. And if you don't get a residency, as a doctor, you don't get to practice medicine. At the same time, 3,700 foreign-trained physicians do get residencies at U.S. teaching hospitals. And I was speaking to the head of a teaching hospital, and I said, how is this, why can't you, I can't believe that the level of education someone might receive in Bangalore versus the U.S., there isn't a differential, because he had told me it all comes down to board scores. And then he said, the thing is this, we can find a lot more reasons not to bring on an American than a foreigner, because we have more access. We can talk to we probably know their professors. And I think at the same time, and because you talked about, well, they show up with a fishy-looking green card, we just don't have a lot of clarity into this immigrant workforce, whether it's high-skilled or low-skilled. So it's easier than to look at an American with a record and say, oh, well, you have a misdemeanor. We're not going to hire you, but we're going to hire someone who's an absolute clean slate to us. And so I think it would be helpful if there was an office that would accumulate this kind of data on immigrants.
Peter, I mean, you obviously have been in this area, in labor law, on the NLRB and all that. Is there potentially a place for an office specifically devoted to pursuing this, or at least shining light on it?
That's a really good point, and it's something that I've been, interested in for quite some time. I think, if you look at Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of all kinds of categories, but one of them is national origin discrimination. What I love about Jason's study is that he looks at actual EEOC cases where Americans have been discriminated against in favor of foreigners or immigrants. And black Americans are discriminated at a higher level proportionately. National origin discrimination, though, when you look at most EEOC cases, goes one way. That is that someone's claiming they're being discriminated against by an employer because they're from a country other than the United States of America. But what we're seeing is employers are discriminating against Americans based on their national origin. The EEOC has enforcement priorities. They change based on administration priorities, and they change over a period of time. They will focus on a particular systemic problem that they perceive to be the prevailing issue of the day. And I would suggest this is one of the prevailing issues that maybe the EEOC, OSHA, other alphabet agencies could take a look at, because Americans are being hurt by it. We've got, data on this now, and I think it's inescapable. But the traditional model has always been to look in one direction only and not look in terms of what is the palpable harm that's being done to Americans by the preference by a number of employers to hire, in my case, the concern is illegal immigrants, but immigrants generally.
I actually had if there was anyone with a question, I've got one. Oh, okay, yeah, go ahead.
So this is back to Kevin about high-skilled immigration, and I know that a lot of the Indian consultancy companies get a lot of flack for abusing the H-1B visa program, but what we're noticing, because I'm from Silicon Valley myself, is that big tech is also abusing these visa programs. And Oracle, for example, is being investigated by the DOL, where they underpaid women and minorities of over $400 million, and they had a preference for only hiring foreign graduates at job fairs. There's a lawsuit, I think, being pushed by a South Korean person at Intel. So my question is there something now bigger at play in the high-skilled immigration field where it's not just Americans that are being discriminated, but this whole idea of nepotism that's coming into play, specifically from the high immigration numbers from Indian nationals now own the labor market in the tech fields. There's now a preference for only hiring their own.
Oh, we've seen that time and again. And there's a lot of political clout behind this. We see when you look at prevailing wages in the tech community, H-1B visa holders could be down anywhere from 40 to 60% of the wage that you would pay an American. So there's definitely a preference from that standpoint. There's also a kind of clanning that goes on. And again, this was again, it's the reversal of EEOC as we know it, where things that wouldn't be tolerated in the workforce, we look for diversity in our workforce. You brought up the case of Ho Roo Sung, the fellow of South Korean descent here in the United States, who was suing his employer, was it Intel? And, you know, he was passed over for promotion several times by people, and his coworkers from Southeast Asia were promoted. So we have a lot of evidence of that. And I'd like to see more court cases on this as well, but certainly it's impacting hiring, it's impacting how people are promoted and treated in the workplace. And again, I think it's a form of asset stripping that's going along, and in a way, I think somewhere in the 1990s, someone made the decision to stop investing in the US and Europe and invest in Asia where they could maximize profits. And what we've seen over the last few decades is the push for the free movement of capital and people across national borders. And it's had negative impacts here, as Jason and Peter and Mark have talked about, to the worker here in the United States.
Is there a question back there?
Yeah, I'd like to ask if there's a kind of a mindset about IT and STEM workers that only foreigners can do that. I spent years, especially when we talk about Disney and PG&E, they were both ERP clients. You know, the consulting firm I worked for at the time dealt with both of them, and I'm familiar with the Disney case. And that's pervasive when people do business process reengineering. They wind up getting standardized processes, they move them offshore. And there's jobs are lost like crazy. But is there a mindset that you're an American worker, you can't do it?
There absolutely is. What came out in the Buchanan versus Tata consultancy case, as well as the Ho Roo Sung case at Intel, they were told that Southeast Asians are more intelligent and harder working than the Americans are. And I think that's a myth, but what we see is, I think it's, at this point, it's hit a level where it's now social Darwinism, and we're seeing people promote their own, and to our detriment. HCL is a ICC, an Indian consulting company. Boeing had outsourced their software development to them, and they were, in fact, working on the 737 MAX. Yeah, so we as Americans are getting used to lower and lower standards of quality out there when it comes to our IT and other forms of service delivery. And in the case of Boeing, it had much greater ramifications.
Are there any other questions? One point I wanted to bring up, I don't think Jason mentioned it. What Jason looked at were actual EEOC lawsuits. So in other words, it's kind of the tip of the iceberg. It's the I assume the strongest cases they went after. I mean, Peter would know maybe more how that works, but those would be presumably the strongest cases with the best evidence. There's got to be a whole rest of the iceberg,
Yeah.
below the surface.
I think what's invaluable about what Jason has done is, when we looked at the studies at the Civil Rights Commission, we had 3 hearings with respect to illegal immigration. What you saw were economists and other researchers who would come by and talk at a 30,000-foot level about economic metadata, and they would say, okay, well, because of A and cosine this and all this other stuff, it must be that blacks are being displaced. So you'd have all this data, but it's important to come down with actual cases that support that type of data, and that's what Jason has done. When I've been involved in these matters, you see this from time to time. You may see, again, I'm one labor lawyer out of thousands, so I may see a discrete case here, a discrete case there, and it triggers something in my mind. I'm going, this really sounds peculiar, but what Jason's done is look at a number of cases where you see over and over and over again a preference for illegal immigrants or foreign-born workers versus Americans, and particularly black Americans.
Thank you. Yeah, one last question. Oh, yeah.
I've been doing this for a long time, but let me just ask if anyone on the panel has a question about this. Look, Jason, you've uncovered some really compelling anecdotes, right? Now, there's nothing reporters love more than compelling anecdotes. In fact, they often ignore the big picture to just tell the specific story, and many people would argue we get a very distorted story because the compelling, pathetic anecdote is really powerful. And yet, you see no stories on any of these cases, even though, as you've discovered, there's a clear paper trail. There's people to interview. There's the whole case there. And it seems that no one is interested. Why do you think it is, any of you? Why are reporters not interested in these anecdotes, which seem pretty powerful and right up their alley?
Any ideas?
It's,
I think it interferes with the narrative. In other words, it's not sort of the storyline that, that the media generally wants to buy into. Though, to be fair, BuzzFeed was one that really did write about this before the president got elected. Now it's all about him when they write about foreign workers. Mar-a-Lago is hiring foreign workers, and it's all true. But before any of that was an issue, they actually wrote quite extensively a whole series of stories, one of which was actually titled, "All You Americans Are Fired," and it was a quote, but I think it was a different instance. So,
Was it?
yeah, I think it was a different instance. It was in Louisiana, I think. So my point is that you're right, in a sense, that one example of several BuzzFeed stories is kind of the exception that proves the rule, that generally speaking, this is the kind of thing you would expect NPR to be emoting about all the time, and the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times should be flooding the zone, and they don't. Let's wrap it up here. Just to remind everybody, I don't think I pointed it out, Jason's report is on our website, cis.org. The whole thing is there, as well as all of the rest of our work. The video and transcript of this panel will be on our site shortly as well. And I want to thank all of our participants and all of you here in the audience, as well as folks at home watching on their computer screens. And hope to see you at our next event. Thanks.